Does autism present differently in males versus females? Are the higher rates in males real, or is it just in bias how we diagnose it? These are common questions I get from followers, and there's a lot of controversy here, so go easy on me. So in this video, we're going to dive a little bit deeper. Let's look at the research and see what's true and what we don't know. First off, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that appears in childhood, basically a condition that affects how your brain functions. Autism was first coined in 1910 by a physician observing a psychiatric patient who was exhibiting some strange symptoms. The term autism comes from the root word autos, which means self. So this clinician observed his patient very inwardly focused. He was really withdrawn and kept to himself. Fast forward to the 1940s, there were two groups of researchers that really pioneered the study of autism. One was in the United States, and the other was Germany, from a researcher who may sound familiar. His name is Hans Aspergers. And Aspergers noticed that there was a group of his patients that were much higher functioning and possessed a lot of intellectual and creative gifts. This higher functioning condition was then known as Asperger's disorders up until very recently with the newest DSM-5, which changed it to just an autism spectrum disorder from level 1 to 3 in severity. Even though it's no longer two separate disorders, a lot of folks still identify with the term Asperger's. There's a lot of controversy here, but I'm only going to stick to one at a time because I can only handle so much heat. There are two main categories of symptoms in autism. The first is social impairments. Folks with autism often struggle with understanding social cues. They may have trouble with language and communication. They may appear withdrawn and seem to have a lack of interest in social relationships. The other category is repetitive movements and fixed interests. For example, folks with autism may rock back and forth or shake their hands or other self-soothing behaviors. When it comes to fixations, often folks with autism have these hobbies that run narrow and deep, bordering on obsessions, whether it be WWE wrestling, comic books, anime, art, etc. It's important to note that the autism spectrum is very broad in terms of functioning. On one end, you have folks that may not even be able to use language. They may have to be in a group home and constantly need care. And on the other end, you have folks that may not get diagnosed till much later in life because they appear to be functioning just fine, yet they tend to have a lot of internal struggles that often go unnoticed. So let's take a look at some of the nuanced differences between males and females. Remember, with all mental health disorders, it's diagnosed from behavioral observation. I read one of the largest studies looking at male and female differences, and the results were fascinating. Women who presented on the more severe end of the spectrum, ones who had intellectual impairment, struggled more than their male counterparts, often with emotional regulation, which is another symptom of autism. However, on the other end of the spectrum, women tended to get diagnosed much later in life, probably due to their ability to mask their symptoms. The term masking or camouflaging refers to one's attempt to fit in that doesn't necessarily come natural to them. It's thought that women with autism are more prone to masking or camouflaging because of the social pressures placed on them to be more social and to conform. One of the other reasons they may blend in so well is because their fixed interests are more appropriate, maybe something like fashion or music. If you haven't seen the show Love on the Spectrum, I highly recommend checking it out. It's a lot of folks who tend to be higher functioning on the autism spectrum trying to find love. There is one character who's a male, well, not a character, he's a real person, who is obsessed with dinosaurs. Now, dinosaurs are super cool, but when you're in your 30s like me, that would tend to stick out a bit. Despite the prevailing idea that folks with autism may not be super interested in social relationships, that may not be true. Folks with autism often really like having relationships, it's just difficult for them. For example, the research findings showed that women tend to make friends really well, but they had a hard time navigating social conflict and keeping friends long term. Now let's get into the differences in prevalence rates between males and females. For a very long time, it's been thought that the number one protective factor against autism is being female due to males being diagnosed at such a higher rate. It's about 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 in most estimates. There are a lot of different theories as to why it is more commonly diagnosed in males versus females. One of them is testosterone in utero, others are genetic mutations. Now, a lot of these are much higher than my pay grade, but they are disputed among researchers, and so we don't know for sure. So in this one extensive study on the differences between males and females in diagnostics, they found that on the more severe end of the spectrum with intellectual impairment, that number shrinks down 2-to-1 male to female. However, on the other end of the spectrum, on the higher functioning end, they find that that ratio goes up 8-to-1 male to female, probably because of that masking or camouflaging. So is the female protective factor real? Are the rates really that far apart? Well, it's clear that there is bias, but it may be pretty hard to cover that ground of 4-to-1 or 5-to-1. When you compare it to ADHD, where it's 2 or 3-to-1, you could see how maybe it is equal, but we're really not sure. On the higher end of the spectrum, people can mask or camouflage their symptoms. It may be much harder to detect. However, on the more severe end of the spectrum, it's really hard to hide those symptoms. It can be extremely debilitating for people, and that's why I think there still is a female protective factor, that 4 to 1, 5 to 1 may be high, but there is still a bias. I understand why these narratives form. People want a desire for equality. However, I think it's okay that there are sex differences in different mental health disorders. For example, borderline personality disorder is much more diagnosed in females and overlooked in males due to this bias. At the end of the day, what's most important is we get better at objectively diagnosing autism, because there are a lot of people suffering, a lot of women who don't get diagnosed who could use help and resources. I hope you enjoyed this video. I look forward to seeing your comments, even if they are kind of critical.